Hi, I'm Heather Marie Montilla, and you're watching PBS Books. Thank you for joining us this evening. PBS Books, in collaboration with GBH in Boston, is pleased to host a conversation with author Katie Gutierrez in celebration of the 2020 Library of Congress National Book Festival. PBS Books is proud to partner with the Library of Congress National Book Festival with the Library of Congress for the National Book Festival. I'm so sorry. We're so excited to be here and so excited that this represents the 10th event of our series. Let's take a moment to hear from the Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden.
Books bring us together as the Library of Congress National Book Festival returns in person on September 3rd at the Washington Convention Center. The festival is free for readers of all ages. We will also be live streaming 3 stages for audiences across the country. Featured authors this year include Janelle Monáe, Leslie Jordan, Niall DeMarco, Nick Offerman, Angie Thomas, and more. So go to loc.gov/bookfest for more.
Thank you. Well, if you don't live in the Washington, D.C. area, which we hope you do, you can, of course, stream all of the content or curate your experience. Go to loc.gov/bookfest. But if you do live in the DMV area, don't forget to go on September 3rd. That's this Saturday between 9 a.m. and 8 p.m. The festival is free and opened to everyone. Well, now through August 31st, PBS Books and PBS stations across the country are hosting a series of 10 virtual events with 11 authors. They are available on demand at pbsbooks.org and the National Book Festival website. Well, tonight we are pleased to have Katie Gutierrez discussing her latest book, her debut novel, More Than You'll Ever Know. It's an evocative drama about a woman caught leading a double life after one husband murders the other, and the true crime writer who becomes obsessed with telling her story. It is a masterful work, and I am so excited to be able to speak with her in just a bit. But before we do, we always like to thank our library partners, more than 1,800 strong across the country, and numerous PBS stations. But most importantly, we'd like to thank all of you for joining us. Well, this evening is live, and we'd love to take your questions for Katie. So if you have a question about her work, don't forget to put it in the chat. In the latter half of the program, we'll be asking those questions and getting Katie's answers. All right, well, let's introduce the guest of honor. Katie Gutierrez is the author of the best-selling debut novel, More Than You'll Ever Know, which is also a Good Morning America Book Club pick for June 2020. She is a National Magazine Award finalist whose writing has appeared in Time, Harper's Bazaar, The Washington Post, Long Reads, and more. She is an MFA from Texas State University and lives in San Antonio, Texas, with her husband and her 2 children. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's so good to be here.
Well, we are so happy and excited to have you. And the way I love to start our program is realizing that not everyone out there has yet read your book. So I'm hoping, in your own words, if you could give a short, brief version of what is your book about.
Sure. It's about Laura Rivera, who is a South Texas woman who's secretly married, and she's a mother as well. She's married to 2 men at the same time in the 1980s. And Cassie Bowman, who's an aspiring and ambitious true crime writer in 2017, who becomes obsessed with telling Laura's story. It's an examination of marriage, motherhood, female ambition and desire, as well as our cultural obsession with true crime.
Well, that is the best elevator pitch for a book I think I've ever heard. Concise.
Well, that's high praise.
But there's so much in there, and I'm really hoping that the next hour we can delve into those amazing themes. What inspired you to write this book? And with the world as it is, why now?
The inspiration for this book came in two parts. The first was back in 2009 or 2010 when I happened across a story about a man who'd been married to his first wife for 53 years. They had 3 children together, multiple grandkids. He was a really successful businessman. The family was sort of a pillar of their community. One night, his wife passed away unexpectedly, which was ruled an accident. But 2 weeks later, somebody stumbled across a wedding announcement in a neighboring community about 20 miles away. And it was this man with the same first name, different last name, and of course, a woman that nobody knew. And it turned out that for the previous 32 years, he had been splitting his time between these 2 women, 2 sets of children, only 20 miles away from each other. He put his 5 kids through the same elite prep school. Both women had served on the school board at the same time, not knowing they had this man in common. And I really was fascinated by the story. It stuck with me in a way, and I think it was so much because of the longevity of the lie. So there was the questioning of the logistics. How did he pull it off? Why for so long, but also, what was the emotional impact both on him and on both of his families. And when I read that story, I kind of briefly went down a rabbit hole of looking at other people who had been discovered to have secret lives, and I found that they were all men. And it, the reason why it's typically a man who has a secret family, the reasons are pretty obvious. I think a patriarchal society makes it, and has always made it, easier for men to keep these secrets than women. But I did wonder what would happen if a woman were in this situation. What would bring a woman to live this kind of double life, especially if she were a mother? And is it ever possible to understand somebody who ends up in this very extreme outcome that I think repulses most of us when we first hear of similar stories? But at the time, I was getting my MFA, I was working on a collection of short stories, and this felt bigger than a short story and very different in tone and scope. And so I set it aside, and I didn't come back to it until 2017 when I was actually on submission with another novel and trying to distract myself from the anxiety of waiting to hear back from publishers to see if it would sell, which it ultimately did not. And I ended up thinking more about this story and who the characters would be. And at this time, it was about, 8 years later, something around there. And I think I was a lot more aware at that point about how little representation I had seen of South Texas Mexican Americans in fiction throughout my life. And even though it was getting better, it still felt like there was this big gap where I really wanted to see my own communities. And so I thought about this story taking place in the 1980s, which is when I was born, during this peso devaluation, which threw Laredo into a massive recession. A third of the city was out of work. It was a very desperate time for a lot of people, and it felt like this very rich time period to set a story about a woman who just fundamentally wants more. At the same time, I was becoming more aware of my conflicted interest in true crime, and I was fascinated with really what was becoming such a cultural obsession with true crime. It was sort of everywhere at the same time: podcasts, docuseries, all over the place. And so I was interested in kind of examining, why are we so obsessed with true crime? And what would happen if a true crime reporter came in and there was that friction between somebody who was trying to conceal versions of the truth and somebody else who wanted to expose them for her own ambition?
Okay, so I want to get back to that because I love that whole theme throughout your story. But before we do, I was enamored with your novel and how well-rounded and vulnerable and fascinating your main characters are, both Lore Rivera and Cassie Bowman. And you've started to describe them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you've given bits and pieces, and people, I think the one hard part for people out there is it's a really complex story, and it's complex on many levels. and not to dissuade anyone to read it, because it is an amazing book and it deals with so many of these really, really important issues, as you can just tell from the beginning of this conversation. So what I was hoping is you could describe these two main characters and what they have in common, or shreds of what they have in common.
Yeah. So the story takes place in two time periods, the 1980s and 2017. And so in the 1980s, Laura Rivera is a 32-year-old international banker. She's married to her high school sweetheart and has 12-year-old twin sons. And she's entering this sort of new phase in her life where, her sons don't need her as relentlessly as they did when they were younger. And at the same time, her husband, who owns an ironworks store in Laredo, is really struggling in this recession to provide for the family. The store is struggling to stay open. And so he moves to Austin on and off for a period of time in order to try to bring in business for the store. Meanwhile, Laura becomes the primary earner for her marriage and for her family. And so that becomes a source of friction between her and her first husband, her and Fabian. And so she is a woman who I think is now entering this almost earlier than midlife, but she's entering into this period of time where it's almost like a window is cracking open, and she finally has the opportunity to discover who she is beyond the roles that she's played for her family for so long. Cassie Bowman is a 30-year-old aspiring true crime writer who grew up watching Dateline with her mother. She has a complicated and painful family history that sort of gives her biases in ways that she doesn't fully understand until Laura is able to point them out for her. She is engaged to a very nice man, but she is sort of resisting actually planning the wedding for reasons she doesn't fully understand. She is sort of desperate to make a name for herself, make a career for herself. At the time the story begins, she's working for a pretty trashy blog, essentially sort of cashing in on the most salacious murder stories, which always seem to revolve around dead women, and specifically dead white women. And so when she comes across an anniversary piece about Laura Rivera's story, she sees an opportunity to write what she would consider a more feminist true crime story, in which the woman is not the victim. She's actually kind of the perpetrator. She might not be the murderer, but she's kind of a perpetrator in a way. And she's also not white. And so I think Cassie sees the opportunity to do something big for herself. And then we see Laura in 2017. She's 66 years old now. She has lived alone ever since everything crashed down in 1986. Her two sons are grown. She's a loving, doting grandmother and now retired. But she is still very much sort of brash and unapologetic and very much herself in a lot of ways. And so she wants to craft the narrative that Cassie is determined to create. So they enter kind of a relationship where they each become sort of both mirrors and foils for each other. So you asked what they have in common, and I would say that both of them are women who want. They're both women who yearn. They're ambitious career women, both of them, but they also, I think the big thing is they want more for themselves, and they are pretty good at self-deceit. And they also, I think, are good at deceiving others and justifying the reasons for deceiving others. So I think that they are women who are not bad. They're not bad. They're not fully bad or fully good, right? Like most of us, they're very flawed women who find a surprising connection with each other.
As individuals, we seem to always have a desire to be known and to be understood. I think in many ways, Cassie and Laura were that way as well. Mm-hmm. Cassie walks around with this sense of shame and with secrets, right? She holds secrets from her fiance. She's holding secrets in some ways from herself, I feel. Laura, right? You've just discussed lots of secrets, two families, dysfunctionality of family seems to be a theme. And you haven't yet said that. It's funny because I used to say, every family is dysfunctional. It's just a matter of how dysfunctional that family is.
Mhm.
And here's examples of probably more on the higher scale of dysfunctionality. You say more about that and about that theme or your observations regarding dysfunctionality of families.
Yeah, I mean, I think that most of who we become in adults can be traced back to our family of origin, how functional or dysfunctional that family was and in what ways. And so I think that, Lore grows up in this very specific place. She grows up in Laredo, Texas, which is right on the border of Mexico. At the time that Lore is growing up, the border is incredibly fluid. People cross back and forth from both sides to eat, to celebrate, to see doctors, to visit friends and family. So the two cities and the two countries are very much one at that time period. And her family of origin is very close growing up, though she's sort of aware that her parents, or that her mother in particular, has another sibling as her favorite. And then, she sort of fell into this relationship with Fabian very early on in high school, which I think is typical in many of these communities and in the community that I grew up in. And so she becomes a mother earlier than she intended. Meanwhile, her sister Marta is struggling with infertility for the next dozen years. And so she carries around guilt for the fact that she wants more beyond motherhood, that she loves her sons more than anything. And yet there is still a part of her that is just a woman and who still wants something else beyond the life that she's chosen. And then Cassie is, she's from Oklahoma, and she is the oldest child. And so she witnesses an act of violence between her parents when she's very young. And that sort of upends her worldview entirely, because until that point, she had this vision of her parents as being happy and in love and normal. And after that act of violence, which continues on and off over the years, it throws her so off balance that she becomes suspicious of everybody she meets. And in a lot of ways, it's why she connects so deeply with true crime, because in her mind, even if the truth is ugly, it's when it's in front of you, it's beautiful. You're not being deceived. So what she wants more than anything is to know and to understand everything about the people she's with and the stories that she's interested in. But she's also ashamed of some of her own actions, which she keeps from her fiance. And so that puts up sort of a barrier in that relationship. That becomes difficult for them to navigate together when there's so much he doesn't know, and also is a person who doesn't necessarily need to know everything about her past, which is very different from Cassie herself. So yes.
Okay. So true crime, we've talked about it a little bit in the beginning and just talked about it some more now.
Mm-hmm.
So our society right now has, for a bit now, has had an obsession with true crime. And I was hoping that you could maybe share a little bit about your observations, if you did research about true crime. I know woven into your text, you give us some facts and information about the consumers of true crime and also the reality of statistics and what that looks like. And I'm hoping you can share it with our audience today.
Yeah. So I think even as a child, the first books that I gravitated to had some element of mystery or crime. They were fiction. It started with sort of like the Nancy Drew books. And then in high school, I was pulling books that were on my mom's bookshelf. So it was a lot of Patricia Cornwell in those days. Dr. Kay Scarpetta was kind of like the main character. She's a medical examiner. And those books, the violence against women that was sort of concealed in the cozier mysteries that I read when I was younger was very much like out in the open. You were witnessing the worst that could happen to women and to women's bodies. But you still had this figure of this sort of detective in Kay Scarpetta who was going to solve the mystery and who was going to, in some sense, get justice. That, as I grew older and, my reading taste sort of expanded to the more literary, changed a bit, but I was still always kind of drawn to more literary stories that had a crime at their center, that, that the author used crime as a lens through which to examine any number of other things. And then at some point, I think it was when Serial first came out, And I just kind of happened across it when I was out taking a walk, and I ended up, going for walks every day to finish the series. And that was sort of like this gateway for me into true crime. But I noticed that the more I listened and the more I watched, that it seemed as though true crime predominantly revolved around violence toward women, dead women, women in peril, and specifically white women. And I became sort of uncomfortable with the fact that, the woman at the heart of these stories was never actually there. She was sort of, and Alice Boleyn does a great job in her book of essays, Dead Girls, of examining kind of how the figure of the dead woman is used as a way for other people, typically male detectives and other male figures, to kind of tell their stories. But I also started being curious about, if what we're seeing so much in true crime is about dead white women, do the statistics bear that out? Like, are the people who are being murdered most often white women? And when I looked it up, I looked up statistics from the FBI database, and white women are murdered. Sorry, let me rewind. First of all, men make up 80% of homicide victims. Women make up 20%. Of that 20%, most women are killed by a current or former intimate partner or family member, which is horrifying. Despite the fact that I think much of true crime focuses on this kind of stranger killer figure. And then when you break down that 20% even further, white women are killed at more or less their stake in the population. Black women are killed at 2 to 3 times higher their stake in the population. And trans women experience violence at 4 to 5 times the rate of cis women. And yet, it was impossible not to notice that these were not the stories that are being told and packaged over and over again. And so it made me really uncomfortable to think that the white woman is serving as more of a symbol than anything else, the symbol of kind of blameless victimhood. And what does that imply about these other women who are killed or who experience physical and sexual violence against them? And so I wanted to kind of take these questions in my own kind of conflicted relationship with crime stories, and in particular true crime stories, and kind of infuse them into the book through the character of Cassie. I wanted her to be put in a position where she has to sort of confront some of her own biases and her own complicity in the true crime genre, and kind of investigate a little bit about, whether and how it's possible and what it would look like to have some of the moral ambiguities of true crime be dealt with more directly, I guess. So yeah, it was top of mind for me as I was researching and writing the book.
Was it hard to, when you found that information, right? How did you process it? Was it depressing for you? Like, was it surprising, or did it make sense? Was it like a puzzle that you were like, oh, like this, how did you take that? You wrote it into your book?
Yeah. I mean, I think all of the above. Like, I think I tend to, just be such a researcher at heart, so reading Alice Boleyn's work and then reading Rachel Monroe's book, Savage Appetites, which really, really examines our cultural obsession with true crime. And if that's something that, anybody listening is interested in, I would so highly recommend these 2 books. Rachel Monroe's specifically looks at why women are true crime's most voracious consumers. Why do women in particular have an appetite for stories that revolve around violence against women? Like, it's a really complicated question. And I think that she comes up with some really compelling answers. And so I think that, the statistics versus the stories, depressing, and I think unsurprising, sadly, considering sort of the state of our country, right? But I think I continue to sort of be endlessly fascinated with this compulsion that we have for true crime, and that goes, I'll speak for myself as well, because I think that I'm still interested in crime stories, and I think that there's still so much value in sort of looking at these darker sides of human nature. But I think that one thing that resulted from the research and the writing of the book was kind of looking at, what does it mean to be a more responsible consumer of true crime? Like, what does more ethical true crime look like? What does true crime look like when it really is pursuing justice or actually really solving, cold cases versus sensationalizing? What does true crime look like when it's not re-victimizing victims? So I think that there are ways to really engage with true crime as a genre, which I think it is an important genre. But I think there are ways of engaging with it, more consciously. And so I think that was one thing, one benefit I think that I personally got out of kind of the research of it.
So one of the quotes, and you started off early, and it's Cassie's mother was a school teacher, and she says, "Whoever writes the history has the power." And when I think about everything you said, and I think that that's, in the early pages of the book, it's really interesting because written throughout the book, the reader is learning these little facts, like these little breadcrumbs to another story of truth that many of us are not aware. And I just want to say that I appreciate that. And even in terms of our country right now, as we're rediscovering our history, relearning stories that maybe we hadn't heard growing up, but now are being told, even in children's books. Yeah. Pick up the latest children's book, and if you are over 35, you're probably gonna, maybe even over 30, you're gonna learn something that you didn't know happened by someone who maybe doesn't look like everyone you learned about in your history book before. So quickly, I wanted to comment on Laredo, which is where you're from. And last week, we actually spoke with the author, Kelly Little Hernandez, who wrote Bad Mexicans, which the full title is Bad Mexicans, Race, Empire, and Revolution on the Borderlands. So first of all, Laredo is on the border or around, right? Yeah. And the book, by the way, from last week was there. I kind of was struck that you're from there. The book, her other book took place there. And as I was reading your book, trying to think a little bit about your personal experiences that you took and infused into your own work, and if you could talk about your personal experience and that impact in telling your story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like I mentioned, there was such a lack of, Latino representation in literature growing up as I was reading fiction. And still to this day, I think that only about 5% of books that are published are by Latinx authors, which is pretty dismal, to say the least. And so, I grew up, like I mentioned, in the city that, at the time was like 99% of Mexican heritage. And so, Laredo was very much a city between two worlds, which is, again, why I thought it was sort of perfect to set a story that's so much about duality and doubleness and crossing both internal and external borders. But I also, I wanted that when I was growing up and even today, my identity as being Mexican American was central to every part of my life. The foods that we ate and the ways that we talked and our relationships with our family and our friends and, the places that we went after school and on the weekends, the things that we did on holidays, like all of these things that are so central to our lives and the way we see ourselves were inextricably tied to Mexican culture. And so I wanted to tell a story about a woman whose identity is just as infused into every page without having her identity itself be the source of conflict in the book. Because I think that's something as a reader, I don't see very often, like I read as many books as I can now that are by Latinx authors, and I love them all. And, but at the same time, I feel like so much of the time, identity is the source of conflict in the book. And I think it's for necessary reasons. So much of the time, identity is a source of conflict in this country if you are not white. And so we need those stories. But I think as a reader, I always sort of craved seeing, I didn't even know I craved, to be honest, until I was in my 20s. I always sort of craved seeing someone who came from a community like mine or my specific community, and whose whose identity and whose culture are a part of everything that she is, but in a way that feels powerful versus oppressive, if that makes sense. And so that was what I was really hoping to do with the setting and with Lore's background as being a Mexican American. And it's, it's something that I didn't even, I think I had to block out of my head the fact that people from Laredo would read the book, because I think I would be too nervous about it otherwise. Because I think when you're writing about a real place, a real community, there's very much the risk of, people being offended by that representation. And it's not, I think in the book, Lore does not see Laredo as this like perfect, idyllic place. But I always hoped that my affection for the city would come through. And what I've heard sort of repeatedly from people in Laredo and in South Texas is this sense of like, oh my God, I've never seen this before. I've never seen South Texas. I've never seen Laredo. I've never read a book that features a Mexican American protagonist, and it's not about immigration or, crossing the border in some way. And I've been thanked. Like, some of the most powerful responses that I've gotten to the book are, by Mexican American readers in South Texas who have, who now live in other places and who say, this book feels like home. Thank you for reminding me what a beautiful people we are. And that is more meaningful to me than almost anything. And so I'm ultimately really proud to have been able, and grateful, that my publishing team was so supportive of this element of the book from the start.
Well, I'm Heather Marie Montilla. For those of you just joining us, you are watching PBS Books. It's my pleasure to be here today with Katie Gutierrez, who is the author of More Than You'll Ever Know, a novel. So let's get back to the conversation. The theme of female desire versus motherhood, big theme in your book.
Mm-hmm.
How did you, I think you shared a little bit that you are a mother of two.
Mm-hmm.
And so how did that play? I don't know if I can wait any longer to know if your husband, if he read the book, and at what moment he read the book, and did he have any questions? I should ask that first.
He said from the beginning, I'll read it when it's published. And like, God bless him, he waited till the very end. But he read it, but he has been incredibly supportive the entire time I've been writing the book. I always jokingly call him, my street team, my publicity street team. But it is always hilarious, like if somebody asks him if he's if he's somewhere by himself and he ends up talking about me or the book, and, someone will ask him, oh, what's it about? And to hear him kind of like summarize the story, and then describe kind of the person's reaction at the end of like, oh, like, ooh, okay, that's where your wife's head goes. Okay, sorry for you guy. But no, he's been incredibly supportive of the book from day one, and really, such a great person to brainstorm with. There are so many elements of the story that we actually brainstormed together at different points. But in terms of the motherhood theme, so I always knew that Lore had to be a mother because of the ways that it would complicate the story. And because I think historically motherhood is a huge reason why women have not had secret families. Up until the 70s, women still needed their husband's permission at the bank to open a credit card. So they're like, up until fairly recently, there were some pretty solid roadblocks for women when it came to financial independence, the opportunity to travel for long periods of time and be absent from their families. Like, we know that women, even who work outside the home, tend to bear the brunt of domestic labor inside the home. And so if they're gone for long stretches of time, they tend to be a lot more missed, right, in some ways. And so all of these things, I think, have made it more difficult for women to live this kind of double life. And I'm sure there are a lot of women out there, and me now included, going like, why would you want to? But as I was writing the book, I actually started drafting the book the month that I got pregnant with my first daughter. So this was in 2017. And from start to finish, my daughter is now 4.5. My son was born in September 2020, so he'll be 2 in a few days, actually. And so I think that the theme of motherhood became a much richer and stronger through line than I anticipated when I first started writing the book. Especially because, I was quite sudden, like I wrote the book and edited the book both through 2 periods of like those early newborn days of no sleep, and especially with the first kid, like really trying to figure out how to be a mom and what this new life would look like, and realizing that I was a different person fundamentally than who I'd been before, and I had to figure out who that person was. And yet there's obviously, there's the mother in me who's new, but then there's also the residual of whoever, the residue of whoever I was before, as well as kind of like a new person that forms in addition to who you were before and in addition to the newness of being a mom, right? You become somebody new as a person on top of those things. And so experiencing all of this, and throughout the course of the pandemic, where our childcare situation has been very patchy or non-existent most of the pandemic, like so many other people's, and I think that there has been a lot more I have recognized so much more during these last few years, how much mothers and women hold up this country, right? Without
no doubt. I mean, it's crazy. And I think it became so much more evident during the pandemic. And I do want to comment on something you said, which is just part of it is to realize that once you become a mother and you start to introduce yourself, I don't even think I always introduce myself by my name. I'm so-and-so's mother, right? Yeah. And I literally will see other mothers put that in their cell phone, right? Not my name, but like, my kids, mother of. And I think it was super interesting, that element in your book of the motherhood and just this conflict of, I am a person outside of being a mother, yet I'm so needed in this role. And then Lorraine, who she has a huge job. And I know that also is often very taxing on, it's never easy to have a big job. I mean, we all know that. I mean, you now as, you as a writer and as a mother, like that is a hard balance also, because your studio might be in your house, right? So little people, your mom, right? And they will find you. You can think you're in that little corner. They will find you,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, there's kind of like this eclipsing of your identity, when you become a mom to other people. It's even like, you might bump into another woman at the park with her child, and all you really talk about are the children, right? Like as if you as people are sort of like fundamentally eclipsed by the people that you've created. You take your kids to the doctors, or any other kind of appointment. Nobody refers to you by your name first or last. It's always, they just call you mom, right? Like that is your identity. And then on top of all this, there's this sense that you can't, once you become a mother, if you dare to sort of speak about the challenges of motherhood and the ways in which this country is not set up to support mothers and families, you are like, crucified. And I can say this from experience because I also write about motherhood for Time magazine pretty frequently. And I get a not insignificant amount of hate mail. Like one email I got in response to a piece in which I talked about being like sort of losing myself to motherhood during the pandemic. The piece said that it was the email said it was a child-hating rant and I'm not cut out to be a mom. I should have used contraceptives and gotten a pandemic puppy instead, and that they fear for my children's safety. And this was in response to literally an essay where I'm talking about how badly I felt because, I wasn't giving my children the kind of mom that I thought they deserve, and I know they deserve. And so there's this really toxic expectation on mothers to put a pretty face on the whole thing. And, Lore says at one point in the book, motherhood is not pretty. Motherhood has teeth, and it can consume you. And so, yeah, that became, and it still is a very important theme to me, to write about both in fiction and nonfiction, because, it just feels like an impossible position to maintain.
I think it is. And I think, though, I think your book helps to raise these conversations, though, because if not, I think people are sometimes afraid to have those conversations about how they feel, or, they might think they're alone, and to realize that there is a space to talk about their frustrations, you don't have to go out and have two families to be able to air those challenges. But I think that there is, and you use the quote, the cruel banality of motherhood, especially those early weeks when you don't even know how to be a mother. And 48 hours after you give birth, you're like patted on the back and good luck with that, and it's, I didn't even know how to change a diaper. And obviously I don't want to get too off focus, but that is related to your book, because I think it helps us to understand and maybe even show empathy of how someone is able to want to refine themselves. And there are other ways to do it. And I think you help also through the exploration of Cassie as a character to explore some of that too. I wanted to talk about lines and borders and kind of like right and wrong, because these are all things that, as I was reading, and you so eloquently, craft even thoughts of, well, I didn't do anything wrong yet, and we're kind of like, was it wrong? And, and I think that playing with spaces, even the fact that Loreto was on the border and that she's crossed, or that your text goes in between English and Spanish at times. And Cassie also is like, I'm getting used to it, right? Like, and so I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about this idea of lines and crossing these lines, and how maybe it's even your editing process, like how you were able to develop all of these lines and this theme throughout your novel.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of goes back to, the initial questions I had when reading these Secret Life stories, which are the questions of, how did it begin? How did it maintain? How did you justify it to yourself at every step of the way? What were the emotional boundaries you crossed, both within yourself and with these other people in your life? And so, I was really interested in, like, as I mentioned, I think when we read their stories, these people seem so unfathomable to us, like, who does this, right? But I think that we are all capable of making morally ambiguous choices that seem okay one by one, but that add up into something extreme. And so I think that was what I was wanting to play with, both from Lore's perspective and Cassie's perspective. Because I also, and it was also, I think, a little bit of a pushback against, where, like, I think so much of the country is this strange push toward, like, this almost puritanical, morally superior kind of way of acting in the world. And the fact is, none of us are blameless. We all are guilty of our own little indiscretions, our own tiny lies. And so I think that I was wanting to sort of push back against this idea of female characters in particular that needed to be acting in this clear-cut moral way the entire time, because I think really, when it comes to crime as well, Cassie notes that murders don't just happen in the moment; they happen in all of the moments that lead up to the moment. She thinks that is that's part of what makes true crime so addictive, because as the consumer, the reader, the viewer, you get to sort of track the path in this almost godlike way that ends in a person's violent death. And I think that was something that I wanted to sort of echo in the book through the reader basically seeing each small decision as it happens, already knowing the outcome. Because from the start of the book, Lore is married to two men at the same time, and one of them is murdered and the other is in jail for it. And so I liked the idea of starting with what you think happens, and then tracing it back to not the big decisions, but the small ones that lead up to it.
So your writing process, I'm always intrigued, especially because you're flipping time, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're in 2017, you're in the 1980s, you're at a different moment, right? How did you write this? Did you write it sequentially, or did you flip it back and forth in your process?
So the first draft was actually all of Lore's 1980s chapters, I think up until she and Andres sleep together for the first time. So I think it was about 120 pages that were entirely Lore's perspective. And then I switched to Cassie's perspective all the way up until the point where the two women meet. And then I began braiding the three threads together. So going back to the 1980s and then alternating between current day Cassie and current day Lore. But when I sent that to my agent, she was like, this isn't quite working. The reader is too invested in Lore by 120 pages in, and it takes too long to get back to her once you introduce Cassie, who doesn't have as inherently a dramatic a story. And so it took a lot, I went through so many rounds of edits with this book, both with my agent in advance of going on submission and then with my editors afterwards. And so much of it was about finding the right points of view and the right structure. So, Cassie, I think I started her out in third person point of view, but I didn't feel like I could get close enough to her voice. Whereas for some reason with Lore, writing her from third point of view felt very natural to me for the 1980s chapters. And so I had to switch that entirely. And then once we kind of realized, okay, Lore and Cassie needed to alternate from the beginning, it was about figuring out the pacing and making sure that each chapter sort of played off each other in the ways that they needed to, and that Lore and Cassie were meeting in the present day early enough that it sort of became the hinge that the rest of the book would sort of draw from. And so there was a lot. So much of this book felt like a puzzle after the first draft. They were just, I think on my computer, they're saved up to version 20, and that was before I went on submission. So it was a lot of editing. At some point I had pages on the floor and I was cutting them up by hand because I was just so stuck. I felt like I needed to see them in a different way. So, there were sticky notes on the walls. It was honestly so chaotic, trying to get it into the right shape.
So did you always know you wanted to be a writer?
I did. Yeah, I started writing stories when I was a kid, and I was a reader before I was a writer. And ever since I started writing stories when I was in third grade, I think, that was all I ever wanted to do and all I ever said I wanted to be. And so, yeah, pretty much, my entire life, I've been trying to get to a place where I could write novels. And so I've written in a lot of different forms and mediums, and also edited in my career. But I feel like, now I'm finally where I have wanted to be since I was a kid.
Well, congratulations. So you are going to be speaking at the National Book Festival, the Library of Congress National Book Festival, this coming weekend, yes. September 3rd. Do you know what you're doing there, who you're speaking with? Do you have your time plans?
I do. So I will be speaking on a panel with Amanda Eyre Ward and Kirsten Chen at 9:45 on Saturday morning. And the panel is called Truer Than True Crime. And it is, it will be on the Poplit stage, I believe. And then there's a book signing that I'll be doing after that at 11. But I'm really excited because I love Amanda and Kirsten's books. And yeah, I'm really excited to be there with them and really honored to be a part of the festival.
Well, I'm so excited for you. Now, have you planned the rest of your day? Because this is where it gets tricky. I went there for work in 2019, and I was working, and I realized that all of these amazing conversations are happening throughout the day. So my one advice is go to loc.gov/bookfest and schedule and plan out what you want to do, because the good news is all of the content will be recorded and you can see it later. But it is, first of all, how cool for everyone who loves you. If you're in a room and able to listen to another author, I'm sure people can be like, oh my gosh, it's Katie. I mean, it's fun, right? It's all like book nerds like us, right?
Yeah.
It's not that people always recognize you walking down the street, but they will there. And it's going to be so much fun. I'm so jealous for you. I'm not going this year, super sad, but I will be streaming it and I will make sure to see your interview. I can't wait to see the panel discussion.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming and to share this book. I think having a protagonist who is Mexican American and really being able to think about true crime and double lives and these hidden messages, it's been fun to explore secrets and to kind of understand the psyche of you a little bit. And you know, I'm sure your husband gets some weird looks.
Yeah, totally.
But I'm sure it makes it more fun too for both of you.
When we're not just being completely frazzled, exhausted parents.
I understand, for sure, for sure. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I hope that when your next book comes out, you'll let us know. I want to share a little bit more about the Library of Congress National Book Festival, remind people that it is on September 3rd between 9 a.m., 8 p.m., and also all of our series of 10 conversations. You can stream them, go to pbsbooks.org or the Library of Congress website. Until next time, I'm Heather Marie Montilla. Happy reading.